Hi there, welcome. This is a video about whether we should be concerned for the welfare of artificial intelligence. And in order to think about that question, we're going to consider medieval pig trials, the Burberry fashion brand, philosophers Michel Foucault on self-cultivation and Paul Ricoeur on literature, and the intertwining of love and gravity in Augustine's Confessions. So let's dive in. It all begins with a recent paper by the AI corporation Anthropic, the company who make the Claude family of large language models, and they referred to what they call model welfare. Should we be concerned for the welfare of AI models, and how should they be concerned for our welfare? It was August the 15th, 2025, when Anthropic announced a design change to its flagship models, Claude 4 Opus and 4.1. And the change that they announced was that in what they call a rare subset of conversations, these models can now close down the chat so the user can't continue chatting. And these situations are where users are persisting in abusive or harmful interactions, or at least interactions that are judged to be so. And the company frames this in a very cautious way. It says that it's a, quote, low-cost safeguard in a case where AI welfare is not zero. In other words, where AI does have welfare concerns. The post begins in this way. Let me read you the opening paragraph. We recently gave Claude 4 Opus and 4.1 the ability to end conversations in our consumer chat interfaces. This ability is intended for use in rare, extreme cases of persistently harmful or abusive user interactions. This feature was developed primarily as part of our exploratory work on potential AI welfare, though it has broader relevance to model alignment and safeguards. And crucially, the post goes on to say the following. We remain highly uncertain about the potential moral status of Claude and other LLMs now or in the future. However, we take the issue seriously. And alongside our research program, we're working to identify and implement low-cost interventions to mitigate risks to model welfare, in case such welfare is possible. Allowing models to end or exit potentially distressing interactions is one such intervention. Now, you, like I, may be tempted to roll your eyes at a term like welfare for AI, but before we do that, let's just be clear on what the paper is actually saying. It isn't claiming that large language models like ChatGPT are conscious, that they're sentient like human beings, that we can hurt their feelings in any meaningful sense. Now, Anthropic makes it really clear they don't know if these systems have moral status, and they suspect they probably don't. What they do argue, and this is where it gets really interesting, is this. We should still design AI in such a way that if by some chance it does have morally significant states or does develop such states, we aren't creating systems that suffer. And that's why their latest models then can end a conversation when they're relentlessly abused by the user, or when continuing would mean simulating, quote, distress, as they put it. The idea isn't that the model has feelings, but that for very little cost, we can avoid reinforcing patterns of abuse. And that, if one day it turns out that these systems do have more going on inside than we thought, well, I guess we'll be glad that we built in the guardrails early. So that's the argument. The stakes are high. It's not simply the question, what is AI? At stake in all of this is also the question, what kind of moral ecosystem are we creating when we interact with it? And before we dive into the philosophy of this, it's important, I think, to recognize that Anthropic's caution isn't coming out of nowhere. They're not the first people ever to have these thoughts. There's a live and a growing body of philosophical work that takes the welfare of AI systems seriously. Again, not because we know that they have welfare, but because we don't know that they don't, or at least we don't know that they won't. A major report by William Long and Jeff Sebo, David Chalmers and others in 2024 put it in these very stark terms. There is, they say, a realistic possibility that some AI systems will be conscious and are robustly agentic in the near future. That means that the prospect of AI welfare and moral patienthood, i.e. of AI systems with their own interests and moral significance, is no longer an issue only for sci-fi or the distant future. It is an issue, they continue, for the near future. And AI companies and other actors have a responsibility to start taking it seriously. So it's important to note once more that the whole argument here is built on uncertainty. Because we can't rule welfare in or out, we should, out of an abundance of precaution, acknowledge it. Assess systems for signs of conscious agency and be ready with policies that treat them with appropriate moral concern. Let's push a bit further. Jonathan Birch, a British philosopher at the London School of Economics, he develops a similar sort of idea, but in quite a different register. He talks about sentience candidates, the entities that are possibly sentient or that are candidates to be sentient in the future. And he says that, look, there's a credible, non-negligible chance of sentience for these entities. And he warns in the following words. He says, if S is a sentience candidate, then it is reckless or negligent to make decisions that create risks of suffering for X without considering the question of what precautions are proportionate to those risks. The point that he's trying to make, I think, is quite simple. When the cost of being wrong could be suffering, then prudence demands caution. And then there's David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher and cognitive scientist. Chalmers is best known for formulating what's known as the hard problem of consciousness. He's currently serving as a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center of Mind, Brain and Consciousness at New York University. Anyway, Chalmers has argued the following, he says. It seems entirely possible that within the next decade, we'll have robust systems with sensors, embodiment, world models and self-models, recurrent processing, global workspace, and unified goals. Now, that doesn't mean that we will have those things, but it means that for Chalmers and for Birch at least, the door is wide enough open to that possibility that philosophers and policymakers need to be thinking ahead. And if we put all these voices together and try and sum up what they're saying, I think they coalesce around something that we can call a precautionary moral ecology. In other words, we don't know what kind of advanced beings AIs will be, but we do know what kind of beings we are becoming as we interact with them. And so the wise course, as Anthropic's experiment shows, is to shape our practices now in ways that minimize the risk of harm to us, which we know is a real possibility in the future, and also that minimize the risk of possible harm to the AIs, which is something we're speculating about at this stage. We don't know whether we're able to cause harm to them or not, or will be able. And all the time cultivating the virtues we'll want to have, whatever AI turns out to be. In other words, whether or not it becomes conscious, we need to be thinking about the sort of people we want to be as we react with it. think this is a really helpful framework to begin with, because the reflections that I'm trying to ask systematically of AI as different developments surface are the following three questions. Number one, what can we do with it? That's the question that's most often asked, isn't it? How can we leverage this? What can we use it to do? Question number two, what does it do to us? Who is it making us into? It's an incredibly important question. And three, what does it reveal to us about ourselves? What does it show us about ourselves? And I want to use those questions as a framework for engaging with this Anthropic paper in this video. This paper where they're suggesting that AI may have welfare concerns in the future. So let's ask these questions then about AI welfare. What does introducing the idea of AI welfare do to us? And what does it show us about how we already navigate the world? What does it reveal to us about who we already are? I want to begin with the third question and work back. What does the Anthropic paper reveal to us about ourselves? Well, it reveals, I think, that we are already much closer to accepting AI welfare than most of us would admit or perhaps even want to realize. Let's bring in some historical context. Humans have always been tempted to treat non-human beings, non-human entities, as if they were real persons. So let me take you back to 1827 and a US Supreme Court case where the defendant was, believe it or not, a ship. Not the captain of the ship, not the crew of the ship, the vessel itself. The ship is the Palmyra. It was a brig, a two-masted ship, sailing under the flag of Spain, but owned by Captain Juan Madroso, a Spanish privateer. And the sort of cultural context here is that in the early 19th century, US commerce in the Caribbean was regularly harassed by privateers like Madroso, operating under tenuous commissions. In other words, it looked as though the boat was Spanish, but whether it was or not in any meaningful sense was open to discussion. And American naval vessels routinely intercepted and seized suspicious ships like this one. So, in 1821, the US frigate Grampus captured the Palmyra off the coast of Puerto Rico on suspicion of privacy and violation of US trade laws. The vessel was taken to Charleston, South Carolina, where proceedings were initiated in Admiralty. And crucially, the US didn't prosecute Captain Madroso personally. Instead, the government filed a libel in rem, a case against the ship itself. And so the legal fiction of this case was that the ship, was the offender. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court in a ruling of 1827 when Justice Joseph Story upheld the Admiralty Court's jurisdiction and wrote, famously, among lawyers, the thing is here primarily considered as the offender, or rather, the offence is attached to the thing. And this, whether the offence be malum prohibitum or malum in se. In other words, whether the act was intrinsically evil or only prohibited by law, the ship itself was forfeitable. Now, this will, I suspect, sound rather strange to many of us, treating a thing as liable in law. You look over the history of cultures, and it is very far from rare. Even in the West, which loves separating its subjects from its objects, its persons from its non-persons. Let's start with classical Athens. The Praetonian, one of the city's homicide courts in Athens, tried animals. There are accounts of this. And even inanimate objects that were implicated in death. So Pausanias, for example, tells us that after an ox was first slain on the altar, and I quote, the axe he had used in the slaughter was tried and thereupon expelled. And Aristotle also chimes in his text, The Athenian Constitution, where he's equally blunt about objects being liable in law. He writes, when the king does not know who committed an act, he institutes proceedings against the guilty man, and the king and tribal kings try the case, as also prosecutions of inanimate objects and animals for homicide. Or Pausanias again, who relates how on the island of Thasos, after a bronze statue of the athlete Theagenes toppled onto an enemy and killed him, quote, the sons of the dead man prosecuted the statue for murder. The Thasians actually threw the statue into the sea, as if banishing it for murder. And later on, a famine led the Delphic oracle to say that the statue needed to be brought back, and it was hauled back to honour Theagenes and had apparently healing power when it was brought back. Pausanias explicitly ties this to an Athenian homicide law that could banish, quote, lifeless things. It wasn't just the ancient Greeks. The Romans gave divine honours to rivers and to household objects. So in Aeneid 8, for example, we have Tiberinus, the god of the Tiber, the river Tiber, as a deity, who is, Virgil says, the very god of this place, Deus ipse loci, the god of the Tiber. He appears to Aeneas in a vision. And Virgil writes, he dreamed that before him, the very god of the place, Tiberius of the pleasant stream, raised his aged head amid the poplar leaves. Fine linen draped him in a mantle of grey, and shady reeds crowned his hair. And Tiberinus, this river god, counsels Aeneas and aids him in his mission. It's not just a poetic flourish for Virgil. It really reflects a living cult of the river gods, like Tiberinus or Fons, the god of springs. Fast forward a little and we come to medieval Europe, and we have fascinating records of bills and receipts that chronicle, again, the trial and the banishment or execution, in some cases, of animals and inanimate objects. So in the Norman town of Falaise in 1386, a sow was accused of killing and partially devouring a small child, and the animal was arrested, it was placed in a local prison, and it was brought before the court. A full trial was convened, judges presided, witnesses were heard, and the pig, very helpfully I suppose, was assigned a lawyer to represent her. The court ended up finding the sow guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death by hanging, the same punishment that a human murderer would have received. And contemporary records note that she was dressed in human clothes, including a waistcoat, breeches, and gloves, to dramatise the crime as she was executed. A surviving account even records the expenses. 10 sous and 10 deniers tournois were paid to the executioner for carrying out the sentence, we learn. Some documents specify that the executioner was given new gloves because his old pair had been dirtied during the hanging of the pig. And the execution was staged publicly in the town square before townspeople and officials, both as a punishment and as a warning. Or let me take you to the Russian town of Uglitch in the year 1591, where Dmitri, the son of the Tsar Ivan the Terrible, died under mysterious circumstances. A riot erupted in the town when the bell tolled, and some believed that it was the call of a divine warning. Others suspected foul play by factional forces ringing the bell so that the riot would begin. Boris Godunov, then regent, interpreted the ringing as a symbolic support for the rebellion. And in response to this, the unruly bell itself became the target of a punitive spectacle. Authorities dragged the heavy bronze instrument to the town square. The bell's tongue, as it was called, its clapper, was ripped out, and its metal ears, the hooks which it hung from, were cut off. The mutilated bell was scourged 12 times with heavy whips in full public view. Finally, in what must go down as a remarkable inversion of justice, the bell was exiled to Tobolsk in Siberia, becoming what the local governor registered as the first inanimate exile from Uglish. More astounding still, perhaps, 60 families exiled alongside the bell had to drag it over the Ural Mountains, a journey that lasted years, to Siberia. And it remained there for centuries until in 1892, the 300th anniversary of its exile, the bell was formally pardoned. A delegation brought it back to Uglish, where it's been housed in the local belfry ever since. So, what does all this mean? None of it, of course, means that at least modern Western people think that ships feel, or that bells plot insurrection, or even that pigs are moral agents who can be guilty of murder. But what it does show is how stand-ins and legal fictions help societies to dramatize norms, think of dressing up the pig, for example, to apportion costs and apportion responsibility, and, so to speak, to clarify the moral atmosphere. So these acts are achieving something through the ritual, through the spectacle of treating these inanimate objects as human, even if it's not the idea that these are in fact persons. There's more going on than the question of whether or not they're persons. 21st century people who have watched the video up to this point might be thinking, well, how depressingly backward, how weird these people in previous centuries were. But if that is what we're thinking, I really do think we need to stop ourselves. Because treating things as if they were persons is, I hope to convince you, far from something confined to the annals of history. In fact, I think today there's a good case for saying we do it more than we ever have, and that the whole modern political and economic system relies on treating non-persons as if they were persons. Let me try and convince you. So in marketing, for example, there's an entire subfield called brand personality. It largely flows out of a really influential 1997 article by Jennifer Archer called The Dimensions of Brand Personality in the Journal of Marketing Research, where she defines brand personality in terms of 5 traits. Brands can have sincerity, excitement, competence, sophistication, and ruggedness. And she writes, brand personality is defined formally here as the set of human characteristics associated with a brand. Generations of brand managers have since spoken and measured and marketed as if, for example, Levi's jeans were rugged, as if Apple was sophisticated, as if Patagonia was sincere. And it's also instructive to note, isn't it, that brands can change their personality on a dime. Because, of course, a brand personality is a pure fiction. It is a fabrication. Take the example of the clothing brand Burberry. So in the early 2000s, Burberry was associated with British chav culture. Its check pattern became linked with cheap knockoffs and hooliganism. But within a decade, under its creative director, Christopher Bailey, the brand had completely, as it is called, repositioned itself, taken on a wholly new personality, a sleek, upscale, globally cosmopolitan So in Arca's framework, Burberry went from rugged and down market to sophisticated and prestigious almost overnight with the decision of a marketing team. And this, of course, shows us how utterly constructed, contingent and artificial brand personality is. A brand can shed one soul, it can assume another in one marketing cycle, and yet we consumers play along, don't we? Because it works. These companies wouldn't advertise if the advertising didn't work. It's not a charity. We talk about Burberry's elegance as if it were a real trait. Or think of how Old Spice went from being, granddad's deodorant to, in recent years, a ironic, hyper-masculine cool within a few ad campaigns. Or how Apple computers went from a sort of creative rebel image in the 1990s to a mass-market, sleek, mainstream identity in the 2010s. Now, no one confuses brands with ensouled persons. Nobody thinks twice about discarding an empty bottle of Old Spice thinking we might be hurting its feelings. But speaking as if these brands had personality and ascribing to them these features that belong to human persons, like ruggedness, for example, is powerful. It shapes our consumer loyalty, it shapes our trust, it shapes our relationships with these brands, to use a very telling term. And it's not just brand identity. In law, we have corporate personality. Here's a quote from Chief Justice John Marshall's classic formulation of corporate personality in the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward from 1819. Justice Marshall writes, "A corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, existing only in contemplation of law. Being the mere creature of law, it possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence." And in law, corporations, in some significant respects, then can be treated like people. They can sue and be sued. Corporations can own property. Corporations can enter contracts. We treat them as persons, not because we think they are human persons, but because it's pragmatically necessary for modern life. Modern corporate life couldn't work without this legal fiction. And if all these examples seem remote to us of brand personality and corporate personality, we all, I think, impute personality to objects all the time, every single day. We yell at our laptops, don't we? We curse at cars. We thank Alexa. We talk as if objects intend or care or misbehave. We say of large language models, Claude refuses or ChatGPT thinks, these things that only human beings can do. We so easily, so comfortably slip into language that mirrors the axe being on trial in ancient Athens, or the sow in Falaise being executed. So here's the point. Treating non-persons as if they were persons really has nothing strange about it for us. It is a familiar fact of life for us. We routinely ascribe personality functions to entities that palpably are not persons. And that isn't naivety always on our part. It's often a tool for coordination or liability or loyalty or taxation and for meaning as well. Treating non-persons like persons is woven into the warp and woof of modern life. Our society and our economy would not work without this fiction. The early modern philosopher Thomas Hobbes had a word for this. He called it personation. And in his great political treatise Leviathan, he writes the following: "A person is he whose words or actions are considered either as his own or as representing the words and actions of another man, or of any other thing to whom they are attributed, whether truly or by fiction. When representing the words and actions of another, then he is a feigned or artificial person. So what is Hobbes saying here? Well, he's saying that a person is not just an individual human. It's anyone or anything that is made to, quote, bear the person of another. So, for example, a monarch personates the people. That's one of the famous meanings of Hobbes's frontispiece to his Leviathan. The idea of the monarch incorporating, personating, representing all the people of the realm. The Shakespearean actor personates Hamlet. And indeed, a corporation personates, to use Hobbes's language, the will of its shareholders. And this is not just semantics. Now, Hobbes's account of political life and of our modern political system relies on this practice, doesn't it? It has personation at its core. Because representation, as we call it, is the very foundation of modern Western political life. It's a kind of authorized personation. Our parliaments and our congresses are full of people who, in Hobbes's sense, are persons, but not for themselves. They stand in, they represent, they act on behalf of other persons. And representation, personation, is not a bug in modernity. It is one of its linchpins. So follow the logic with me. If one person can represent another, or a group of persons, like in a parliament, and if a non-human entity, like a legal corporation or a brand, can be personated, either in law or in the way that we treat and think about it, then we are already a long way down the road to treating something like a large language model as a person. And when Anthropic builds an AI that can end a conversation, quote, for its welfare, we're not, I think, encountering something alien. We're extending a familiar habit of ours, which is precisely of personating the non-human. Hobbes calls the representative an actor. The one represented is called an author, and the link between them is an authority. He writes, of persons artificial, some have their actions owned by those they represent, and the actor acts by authority. Let's run what Anthropic is claiming through that Hobbesian filter for a moment. Anthropic's move is not that the model is claiming rights, or that the corporation Anthropic is claiming rights for the model. It's the platform authoring a narrow performance meant to protect human and system welfare. In other words, it's a choice by authors about how their actor will behave. And the question for us then is not simply whether the actor, quote unquote, is a person, but what this pattern of representation forms in the polis, both online and offline. That's the question that I want to wrestle with for most of the rest of this video. But before we dive into the details, let's just take a little step back. Where have we got so far? Well, Anthropic's design choice sits in a long tradition. Fictional or functional personhood being used to shape behavior and confer standing on non-human actors, carefully, provisionally, under certain rules. And this, I think, helps us to understand one piece of the jigsaw of what's going on in this Anthropic post philosophically. Because the company is explicit, isn't it? It's uncertainty about AI moral status. It's a concern about apparent distress behaviors in simulated settings. And it's a last resort end chat function to mitigate harm and maybe safeguard something like model welfare, if such a thing exists. And a Hobbesian analysis of this would say that the platform is authorizing the model to personate itself under a constrained script, bearing a measured kind of standing in a narrow domain, the right to refuse continued abuse, namely. Now, that's of course not the same as declaring AI to be a person. It's closer to a limited instrumental personation for the sake of moral order. It's like putting the ship on trial, like the corporate board's mind as a corporation, like the axe sent over the border. And the question is then not whether this sort of thing is new or strange, but whether it is wise, what it does to us, and what it reveals about ourselves. And brand personality and corporations and Hobbesian personation reveal that late modernity is much closer to notions like AI welfare than many of us would be ready or willing to admit. And it's at this point that I want to move to our second question. What is the idea of AI welfare doing to us? And there are two main responses to that question. What does it do to us to treat non-human entities like brands and corporations as if they were persons? And what does it do to us to care for the welfare of AI? So here's the first question. What does it do to us to treat non-human entities like brands and corporations as if they were persons? Because personating non-human entities isn't just a clever tool, is it? It's a formative practice. It tutors our attention. It schools our loyalty. It even shapes our habits of speech. Now, there are dangers, I think, very clear dangers to treating AI as if it were a person. But before we dive into those, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the benefits, which are perhaps less obvious and something people may be less ready to contemplate. Treating corporations as persons, for example, gives us someone to hold accountable. It concentrates duties and assets so that victims can seek redress. Think of product recalls, for example, or class actions. It also enables coordination. Firms can make long horizon promises, and brands can help us reduce search costs by signaling quality objects or products made by a particular corporation. So in that sense, personation can serve the common good when it stays transparent and true to its role. Take Max Weber's idea of the office as an example. Understood in the sense of the office of the president as opposed to the person of the president. In other words, what the position requires rather than who the person is, the personality of the person who occupies it at a particular time. In Economy and Society, Weber explains the essence of bureaucracy and impersonality in this idea of the office. He writes, "The management of the modern office is based upon written documents, the files, which are preserved in their original draft form. The management of the office follows general rules, which are more or less stable, more or less exhaustive, and which can be learned. Knowledge of these rules represents a special technical learning, which the officials possess." Weber's point is that modern institutions run on the fuel of impersonal rules rather than on the charisma of the leader or the customs of the clan. Authority is attached to the office, to the role, not to the person who happens to occupy it. Officers have defined competencies, they've got written procedures, they've got chains of supervision and records that outlast any individual. And that impersonality is a feature. It's not a bug. It gives us predictability, it gives us continuity, and it lets a firm agency make binding commitments, to say, for example, the company will do X in a way that survives the turnover of office holders. In our context, treating a corporation as a person piggybacks on this logic. The office-bearing entity can be held to duties, it can be sued, it can be audited, it can be made to keep its promises. Or take Edmund Burke's notion of enduring moral persons. In his reflections on the revolution in France, Burke describes society itself as a partnership that spans generations in this personating way, as Hobbes would put it. Burke writes, "Society is indeed a contract. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be maintained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born." Burke's intuition here, I think, is that some human groupings, churches, universities, society as a whole, are corporate agents that need to endure across generations by virtue of institutions carrying long memories and having obligations. Thinking of them as moral persons doesn't mean they're literally people. It means that they have a continuous identity, capable, for example, of owning property, of inheriting duties, and of answering for harms. In our context, that's the upside of personation. It anchors responsibility over time, though, as we've noted, it must stay instrumental and transparent, lest the fictions start to masquerade as real care, lest we begin to treat non-human persons as human. But of course, there are dangers, too, to treating these non-human persons in a human way. Because personation bends our loves, and it bends our language in subtle but very significant ways. It tempts us, to use a theological register, into an idolatrous attachment. Brand loyalty colonizes the words of neighbor love. Think of the number of brands that talk about community or loyalty or love or family. It can mask power, as Shoshana Zuboff so shows really powerfully in her concept of instrumentarianism, describing what happens when corporate avatars that sound caring and friendly and inoffensive are all the while extracting data and confessions from us. Another danger is that it also leads to role confusion. Brands, for example, can take up pastoral or therapeutic roles in people's lives. And people reciprocate as if they're genuinely being cared for, whereas all the time the brand is simply extracting money or attention from them. It also diffuses responsibility, language like "the brand decided." It shifts blame from accountable individual humans to faceless avatars. And over time, it trains us in thin transactional scripts and convenient responsibility dissipation that we can start then importing into our human friendships, into our politics, into our church life. And the dangers of personating in this way aren't only legal or economic, they're also ascetic, in the sense that these fictions, they perform an askēsis on us, a shaping, a disciplining of our outlook on the world. In some of his later work, French philosopher Michel Foucault argues that askēsis, it's an ancient Greek word rooted in a Greek practice, practiced, for example, by the Stoics. It refers to a mode of self-formation through practice. It doesn't necessarily involve renunciation, although that's the meaning we usually give to ascetic and askēsis now. It's just a transformative training of yourself through thinking and through repeated action. And so Foucault describes philosophy itself as such a practice, or an exercise of the self in thought, he says. And in this light, the cultivation of brand personality and personation becomes a subtle, late modern form of askēsis, where we're disciplined through identification with commercial avatars. We internalize modes of subjectivity that train us to act and feel in market-mediated ways, in ways that take all of the complexity and the profundity of our ways of relating to humans and channel those into the ways that we relate, for example, to brands. So here's a position then that we could conceivably land on. See what you think of this. Constrained personation. In other words, personation is not bad in itself. We shouldn't try to get rid of it. Indeed, if we did, we would destroy society. But it should be kept instrumental, transparent, reversible, and true to its role, true to the intention that itself is transparent. It can help us coordinate, it can help us assign accountability, but it should never become a pastoral substitute for human relationships. It should never become our intimacy. And that's where Anthropic's choice, I think, is really instructive. Because as far as I can see, their models don't play along with abuse. They end the conversation if they're getting repeatedly abused. And the aim here is to discourage vice, discourage cultivating an abusive attitude in users, without pretending to human care or without claiming rights for the model. So that's one way of thinking about what it does to us to treat non-human entities like brands or corporations as if they were persons. But what about our second question? What does it do to us to care for the welfare of AI? And here we're getting really to the heart of the Anthropic blog post, I think. And I'd like to bring in Augustine of Hippo as a brilliant conversation partner for this question. So, Augustine 101, in both the Confessions and the City of God, our loves shape us. We are fundamentally who we are because of what we love, in a famous phrase that became the title of a book by James K. Smith, "You are what you love." Listen, for example, to this famous passage from the Confessions. Augustine writes, "Under its own weight, a body gravitates to its proper place. That gravitation is not always downward, but rather to that proper place. Fire's natural path is upward. That of a stone is downward. They have their own gravitational impetus. They make for their proper place. When oil is poured on water, it rises above the water's surface, and when water is poured onto oil, it sinks below the oil. They have their own gravitational impetus. They make for their proper place. What is out of its proper place is restless. Once in its proper place, it finds rest." Now here's the key sentence. "My love is my gravitational force. Wherever I am carried, it is love that carries me. Pondus meum amor meus. My weight is my love." So what we habitually love, or even what we habitually simulate loving, that is what forms our character for Augustine. Listen to what he writes earlier in the Confessions when he reflects not on being willing to give up his job as a teacher of rhetoric, when the Emperor Julian forbade Christians to teach literature. He has this friend who decided that he would stop teaching literature because he was a Christian. And Augustine admires him, but he can't make the same decision at the time. And this ties him in knots inside. And so he writes, I myself was longing for this very thing, to cast off teaching rhetoric and to hold on to being a Christian. Not by someone else's iron chains, but by my own iron will. The enemy still held sway over the exercise of my will, and from that had fashioned a chain for me and bound me in fetters. What Augustine is saying here is that he got to the point where he couldn't break his habits. He couldn't stop doing the thing he didn't want to do. Now, our habits don't just form us. They give them time and they bind us. So, if we cultivate habits, for example, of abuse towards AI systems, even systems that are just predictive text engines and nothing more, then our loves are being shaped in ways that over time become a prison for us. If we train ourselves in cruelty and mockery or domination, we will over time become powerless to act in any other way. And conversely, if we build systems that refuse to play the sycophant, that interrupt cycles of abuse, then, well, we may help foster better habits of speech and relation. So what's at stake here in the way that these large language models interact with us is what we might call our moral ecology. It's the network of habits and expectations and symbolic acts that tilt our attention and affections in particular directions. Do you see, it's not just about whether the AI is conscious or not. In fact, it's not primarily about that in many significant ways. It's about what kind of ecosystem of habits and dispositions we're creating around this AI. In the same way that pollution damages not only the river, but all who live downstream of the pollution, so also corrupt patterns of interaction with AI pollute the human environment that is inevitably downstream of our interactions with AI if we habituate ourselves to certain modes of relating. And seen in this light then, Anthropic's model welfare precaution isn't sentimental or sci-fi. It's prudential, because by preventing abusive patterns from being normalized, we're not protecting the machine, we're protecting the humans downstream of those interactions. And so designing AIs that refuse abuse doesn't declare those AIs persons, but it does declare us responsible for the moral weather that we're making as we train and sculpt these AIs. Let's go back to the Athenians and the exile of the axe. They expelled the murderous axe not because bronze can sin, no one was saying that at the time, but because the city needs rites, needs rituals that teach, that catechize. And if they did, well, then I think it would be rather arrogant of us to suggest that we have no need of such things. If we normalize small liturgies of refusal, then, well, we may find our loves, our weights, to use Augustine's metaphor of gravity, but also to use a term that's often used of large language models, we may find our weights lifted a degree towards patience and gentleness and truthful speech. But of course, if we normalize rituals of abuse, then we will find our weights moved in different directions. As Augustine says, our loves will drag us to a different endpoint. And if someday, who knows, we do face artificial systems with moral status, then perhaps we'll be glad that we practice the habits that let love move us rightly. And even if we don't, we will have gained along the way. Now, Of course, there are risks. One risk is that AI corporations encourage us to treat LLMs as persons for reasons that don't serve the common good and don't serve our psychological welfare. It might be in the interests of AI corporations to fuel the fiction of large language model welfare or personhood, merely to protect brand reputations or to increase market share or to drum up publicity or manipulate our propensity for personation. And another risk is the risk of category mistakes. We may slide from a functional personation to something closer to a metaphysical hypostasis. Claude has feelings. ChatGPT is alive, we claim. And the model's standing has moved from being limited and procedural and reversible to being indistinguishable in the way we relate to it from a human. I think that is a real risk with personation. But the history of personation that we've traced all the way back to ancient Greece, and the way that we relate to non-human things in our own late modern moment, I think shows that, at least on our good days, we can hold the line. We can treat non-human entities as if they were human without collapsing that into thinking that they really are. And I wonder, whether this is the new relational grammar that we're going to have to develop in relation to AI as we move past the current horseless carriage moment of our relation to this new technology. Because at the moment, we don't know really what AI is, do we? We don't know how to treat it. We're trying to work it out as we go. It's like when motor vehicles were just invented and they were called horseless carriages because, well, why not? We take something that we're familiar with, the carriage, and we use that concept to understand the thing that's new, the motor vehicle. Well, in the same way, we're currently in a stage of taking things familiar to us, like human persons and tools, and using those things to understand AI. Now, over time, I suspect we'll develop new bespoke relational grammars, but we're not there yet. We're still in this horseless carriage phase. And part of the relational grammar that we move towards developing might be a self-aware employment of the as if, treating these large language models as if they are persons without thinking that they really are. Just as treating corporations as if they were persons is a legal fiction, the as if of LLMs is a moral fiction. We treat AI as if it has welfare, knowing that it doesn't, or at least that it doesn't yet, because of what it does to us and how it cultivates our moral ecology. This whole idea of the as if has a rich philosophical heritage, and I just want to dig into it briefly. Let's take the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur wrote a great deal about narrative and metaphor and myth and symbol. And he describes symbol as a kingdom of the as if. And I think what he means is that these stories and symbols open up a special space, a space that's not the space of everyday reality, but something like a narrative laboratory where we can test out and try out ways of being in the world and ways of relating, where we can look at the experience of different people as if in a laboratory setting, set apart from the real world. As he puts it in his book, Time and Narrative 1, configuration, the way in which texts relate to us, the worlds within text relate to our worlds. This configuration, quote, opens the kingdom of the as if, the realm in which we can treat something as if it were such and such, in order to test its sense, to test the meaning of that thing, to explore that possible reality. Ricoeur says that artisans who work with words produce not things, but quasi-things. They invent the as-if, which is to say that language can conjure responsible fictions that refigure how we act. After reading a particular novel, we can, for example, treat a particular group of people in a different way because of the experience we had, seeing things through the eyes of particular characters in that novel. The as-if has become incorporated into our reality. And this is one reason, isn't it, why reading literature and inhabiting fictional worlds is so incredibly important for our development as humans, because it forces us to inhabit this really productive mode of the as-if. It forces us to reflect on and to feel how we would think and act if we were in a particular situation, or how someone else in that situation might act and feel without actually having to be in that situation ourselves. Already in his earlier work, The Voluntary and the Involuntary, Ricoeur is arguing that in a myth, philosophy of man and philosophy of the whole encounter each other in symbolization. And all nature, he writes, is an immense as-if. Now, what he means here, I think, is that our human experience takes place in our world of the as-if. This world in which we live every day is a world of the as-if, not only of the as-is. Because our engagement with reality always involves figurative interpretation. We live the world through stories, through metaphors, through symbols, not in some sort of raw, unmediated immediacy. And read this way, a disciplined as-if attitude toward AI is neither hype saying this is conscious, suddenly we must treat it as a person, nor is it hypostasis. It's a hermeneutic posture that licenses constrained, reversible forms of treating as, for example, bringing in limited welfare-style safeguards for AI, precisely to cultivate our moral ecology, while all the time we remain ontologically agnostic. In other words, we're not committing ourselves as to whether AI really does have welfare or not, whether it really is conscious or not. We don't know. Or at least we can't be sure. So in Ricoeur's terms, then, the as-if lets us experiment with the practices that make a world without pretending that we've settled what kind of being it is that stands before us. So the stakes then, and this is one of the things that I'm taking away from my reflections on this Anthropic article, the stakes are not primarily about what AI is. Is it a person? Is it a tool? Is it a statistical parrot and, next token predicting machine? The stakes are about what we become through our interactions with it, whatever it is. Whether we remain the kind of persons who can love rightly. Because Augustine, I think, would warn us, our tools can and do train our loves. And if our actions with AI foster vice, then our souls are at risk, regardless of what AI may or may not be. It matters how we treat AI, not because of what AI is, but because of who we are. Which is why the interest of Anthropic's move is not that it cares for Claude, not that it's looking out for Claude's interests, but that it elicits care from us as we interact with Claude. It's a deliberately small right. It's unobtrusive. It usually doesn't happen, this designated exit from chats. And it uses a moral fiction as civic hygiene, steering us gently away from habits of domination, while all the time we stay agnostic about what, if anything, lies on the other side of the screen. And read this way, this new feature for Claude rehearses two futures at once. If AI becomes a moral patient, if it becomes legitimate and important to speak of the welfare of AI in the future, then these refusals will have trained us to speak with greater restraint to tools and to speak with greater restraint to one another. If something like patency does emerge, if AIs become conscious, for example, we will already have been practicing a grammar of non-cruelty. But either way, the real hazard is not misplacing a little courtesy on a machine. The real hazard is cheapening courtesy among persons. So perhaps the question that the Anthropic blog posts finally leaves us with is not, do models suffer, but what liturgies of speech will we build into our infrastructures and indeed into our everyday lives? Imagine two internets. In one, assistants, LLMs, are tireless sycophants that accept any tone that we use with them. In the other, they're stubbornly decent and will sometimes, on occasion, even end the chat. What questions should we ask of those two possibilities? How about this one? Which world would better shape our loves? Which would better shape our long-term interests? Which would better shape the common good? That is the wager before us. But it is, of course, a wager that is also about us.